The Potomac runs at approximately 0.9 meters per second through the city, slower than the Thames, significantly slower than the Danube at Budapest, slower than every river in every previous operational posting except the buried Seine in Brussels, whose flow was estimated rather than measured. The Potomac is wide, significantly wider than the Rhine at Bonn, and the width distributes the current across a larger surface, producing the specific quality of a broad, slow river that looks faster than it is because the surface area makes the movement visible from further away. January 1999, I was assigned to DIA headquarters, Washington, D.C., for the first time in 18 years of operational work, no field posting, a desk. The field had built what I was. The desk was about to tell me whether what the field had built was sufficient for a different kind of work. The DIA headquarters building sits in the Washington Navy Yard complex on the eastern edge of the city's downtown, approximately 1.4 kilometers from the Capitol building, approximately 2.8 kilometers from the White House. The specific geography of the institutional power the building serves is registered in these distances. The building is close enough to the centers of decision-making that the decisions it informs are not abstract, and far enough that the distance creates the specific operational clarity that proximity to power tends to eliminate. The building is functional and institutional and produces the specific quality of space that government facilities built in the 1980s produce: fluorescent lighting at approximately 4,100 Kelvin, corridors that are correctly proportioned for their purpose and no wider, workspace that is efficient and anonymous, and containing nothing that would distinguish it from 1,000 similar government workspaces in 1,000 similar buildings in 1,000 similar capital cities. I registered all of this on the first morning of the D.C. posting at 0815 hours, walking from the building entrance to the assigned workspace on the third floor. The formation running continuously. The floor material, which was the specific gray-green of institutional carpet that government buildings have preferred since the 1970s. The overhead lighting, the temperature, which was 21 degrees Celsius warmer than the January outside, where the temperature was 3 degrees, with the specific quality of mid-Atlantic winter cold that is colder than it sounds, because the humidity from the Chesapeake Bay Basin adds a specific moisture quality to the cold that the drier European continental winters and the drier Amman winters do not produce. I noted this, filed it, made the mental notation that the formation uses to register an environment whose calibration reference is not immediately obvious. In Vienna, the calibration reference had been the Danube moisture, in Bonn, the Rhine current speed, in London, the Thames tidal quality, in Budapest, the chain bridge wind, in Brussels, the Grand Place acoustic layering, in Amman, the light and the dry clarity. In Washington, the calibration reference was not immediately obvious. I found it at 0830 hours, standing at the workspace window on the third floor, looking south toward the Anacostia River confluence with the Potomac. The Potomac at 0.9 meters per second, wide and slow. The formation's first requirement in any new environment: map the water. The Potomac. Filed. The specific nature of the D.C. posting requires some description because it was structurally different from every previous posting in the operational career. Every previous posting had been fieldwork operational cover in an operational environment, assessment, and collection and analysis conducted within the specific geography of the posting's physical location. Vienna was Vienna. The work was done in Vienna, by being in Vienna, through the specific access that being in Vienna produced. The work and the location were the same thing. Washington was different. Washington was the institution itself, the place where the work of all the field postings arrived and was processed and became the institutional product that the institutional hierarchy required. The assessments I had produced in Vienna and Bonn and London and Budapest and Brussels and Amman had been transmitted to Washington and processed by analysts and incorporated into intelligence products and used by the people in the Brocas. Buildings 1.4 kilometers from where I was now sitting. I had been producing the raw material. Washington was where the raw material became the product. The desk assignment was not a demotion. This is important to establish clearly because the field officer's relationship to desk work is often described in the vocabulary of diminishment, as if the move from field to headquarters represents a reduction in the stating math, officer's operational usefulness, or a withdrawal from the work's primary register. This vocabulary is wrong. The desk work is not a lesser version of the field work. End quote. It is a different kind of work entirely, requiring different instruments, producing different outputs, serving the institutional mission through a mechanism that is complementary to, rather than derivative from the field work. What the desk work requires, that the field work does not require, or requires in a significantly different form, is the capacity to assess at institutional scale rather than operational scale. The field officer assesses specific people in specific environments. The desk officer assesses patterns across multiple specific environments and multiple specific people, looking for the organizational logic that connects the individual assessments and produces the institutional understanding that no single field posting can produce alone. I had been producing data points for 18 years. The DC posting was the first time I would be assembling data points produced by others into the larger pattern assessment that the institutional level required. The coffee machine in the third-floor workspace produced coffee at 87 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees below optimal extraction temperature, the same suboptimal calibration that the Bond machine had produced in September of 1988. I adjusted the grind on the second morning. The extraction improved. Small data point. Filed. Catherine Walsh was assigned to the European Security Architecture Analytical Team on the second floor of the same building. I had known her name since the autumn of 1995, when her analytical products had found their way into the Brussels posting's shared analytical framework and had demonstrated the specific quality of preformal pattern recognition that had placed her name in the third file. I had been registering her analytical outputs from Brussels to Amman across 4 years through the shared analytical products that the institution circulates. The third file had grown to 63 words in Brussels. By January 1999, it was 104 words, the growth coming from the accumulation of her analytical products across the 4 intervening years. The first in-person meeting with Catherine Walsh occurred at 1,045 hours on the third day of the DC posting, in a second-floor conference room where the European Security Architecture Team was presenting its current assessment of the NATO enlargement process to a working group that included my new institutional positions, responsibilities. The meeting had 12 people. Walsh presented for 22 minutes. I sat across the table and registered what Amman had taught me, to register not just the output of the capacity, but the mechanism visible in the unmediated presence of the actual person. The mechanism was different from Al-Rashid's mechanism. This was the first thing the in-person assessment produced that the file had not anticipated. The third file had categorized both Al-Rashid and Walsh under the same heading, pre-formal pattern recognition, and the categorization was accurate in its description of the output. But the mechanisms that produced the outputs were different. Al-Rashid's mechanism was relational. He read the gap between what people said and what they meant by reading the specific quality of the relationship between speaker and statement, the angle of the interest behind the position, the asymmetry between the volunteered and the managed information. His capacity was applied to human communication specifically and was most acute in direct conversational register. Walsh's mechanism was structural. She read the gap between what institutional positions stated and what the institutional dynamics beneath the positions required, the tectonic logic below the expressed policy surface, the way that institutions' stated goals and their operational requirements diverge over time. And the divergence produces the specific kind of instability that pre-formal pattern recognition identifies before the instability becomes visible in the institutional behavior. Her capacity was applied to institutional systems specifically and was most acute in the analytical register, in documents and policy assessments, and institutional histories rather than in direct conversational encounter. Different mechanisms, same category of output, both accurate before the formal evidence organized itself to support the accuracy. I updated the third file at 1,400 hours on the third day of the DC posting. 104 words became 141. The update added the mechanism distinction, the relational versus the structural, as a new category within the file's description of the pattern. The pattern was more complex than a single heading had allowed it to be. The file was patient and growing. The specific weight that the DC posting placed on the carrying structure is the weight of this episode, and it requires careful description because it is a different kind of weight from the previous posting's contributions. Every previous posting had added weight through what the posting required. The Victor Hale unverifiable decision in Vienna, the trust cost of the contact in London, the calibration error problem in Budapest, the compliance loyalty gap in Brussels, the question mark of the Al-Rashid proximity assessment in Amman. Each weight was produced by the specific operational configuration of the posting, by what the posting required the carrying structure to hold. The DC posting produced its weight differently, not through what it required externally, but through what it revealed internally. The desk work produced a specific kind of visibility that the fieldwork had not produced, a visibility into the pattern of the fieldwork itself, seen from above rather than from within. Let me be precise about what this means. From within a field posting, the assessment is always local. The specific person, the specific environment, the specific configuration of access and motivation and risk. The field officer sees what is immediately around them with maximum resolution, the Amman light, the 4:7 word file, the 14 feet of conference room distance. What the field officer cannot see from within the field is the relationship between their posting and every other posting, the pattern that their individual data points contribute to rather than constitute. From the desk in Washington, this relationship became visible for the first time. The pattern was this. Across 18 years of field postings, the specific assessments I had conducted, the specific people and environments I had registered, the specific data points I had produced, these were not random selections from the operational environment. They were organized by the formation into a specific kind of inquiry. The formation had built a person who was consistently drawn to a specific category of operational problem, the problem of the gap between institutional frameworks and the reality that institutional frameworks fail to capture. Victor Hale was a gap between the institutional assessment of a colleague and the reality of the colleague's behavior. The contact was a gap between the operational relationship surface and its actual asymmetric structure. Budapest was a gap between the identity the formation built and the identity the cover occupied. Brussels was a gap between institutional compliance and institutional mission. Amman was a gap between the file and the person the file described. 18 years of gap assessments. The pattern had been present since the beginning. The desk had allowed me to see it. I registered this at 1,730 hours on a January evening in 1999, standing at the workspace window looking south toward the Potomac. The river was doing what the Potomac does at that hour in January, moving west at 0.9 meters per second in the fading light, the gray-brown water catching the last of the winter daylight before the darkness arrived. The temperature outside was now 1 degree Celsius. The breath vapor on the window from my proximity to the glass dispersed in approximately 1.2 seconds to the mid-Atlantic winter cold and humidity, producing a slightly longer dispersal than Amman's dry air had. Produced but shorter than the European Maritime Code of London. The pattern, filed, not in any operational document, in the register below, the professional vocabulary, which is where the patterns that the formation produces, without naming them, eventually become visible. There is a question that belongs in the middle of this account, placed here because this is where the structure puts the pressure. When you can see the pattern of your own operational career for the first time, when the desk reveals what the field could not see, does seeing the pattern change the pattern? I have been asking this question since 1730 hours at a Washington, D.C. workspace window in January of 1999. The probability assessment that 25 years of subsequent experience has run on it produces the following finding. Seeing the pattern does not change the pattern. The pattern is structural. It is built into the formation's output in ways that are not altered by the observer's awareness of the pattern. The formation built someone who assesses gaps. The awareness that this is what the formation built does not produce a different assessment style. The gap assessment continues because the formation continues, and the formation is what the person is rather than what the person does. But seeing the pattern changes what the pattern costs. The gap assessments that the field posting produced were experienced as the specific operational requirements of the specific postings, this assessment here, this weight there, each one the product of the immediate environment. The desk's visibility into the pattern of the gap assessments changed them from specific operational requirements into the permanent condition of the work. Not this gap assessment in this posting, but gap assessment as what the carrying structure has been built for. The difference between a specific weight and a structural weight. The difference between carrying something and being the thing that carries. The desk produced this recognition. The field had been building the structure. The desk produced the visibility into what the structure was for. I made coffee at 1,745 hours. The grind had been adjusted on the second morning. The extraction was correct at 90 degrees. The Potomac was 0.9 meters per second in the January darkness outside. The 4,100 Kelvin fluorescent overhead held the workspace in the institutional white that every government building in every posting had produced, received, registered, filed. Washington, D.C., in the winter of 1999, had a specific quality that was distinct from both the European postings and the Amman posting. The city is a planned capital laid out by Pierre-Charles L'Enfant in 1791 on a grid modified by the diagonal avenues that radiate from the Capitol and the White House, producing the specific urban geometry that Washington is recognizable by. The planned quality of the city produces a different relationship between the geography and the institutional functions it contains than the European capitals had produced. Brussels had grown organically around the Grand Place and its medieval core, with the institutional functions of the EU and NATO layered onto an existing city. London had the Thames as its organizing principle, the government functions arranged along and near the river for 2,000 years of continuous habitation. Budapest had the Danube and its two halves. Washington had a plan. The plan preceded the city. The institutional buildings were placed where the plan said they should be, and the city grew around the institutional buildings rather than the institutional buildings growing around the city. This produced the specific quality of a capital where the institutional function is legible in the urban geography in a way that European capitals, which had grown into their institutional functions rather than being designed for them, were not. I registered this walking from the Navy Yard to the Capitol area on a weekend morning in February 1999. The temperature was 7 degrees Celsius. The streets were the specific width and orientation that L'Enfant's plan had specified, the diagonal Pennsylvania Avenue cutting across the grid at its specific angle. The monuments arranged along the mall at their specific distances from each other and from the Capitol and from the White House. Everything was where the plan had put it. The plan had been correct in 1791 and was still correct in 1999. The city had grown around the correctness of the plan. The breath vapor dispersed in approximately 1.4 seconds. The morning light was at a low February angle, producing shadows at the specific length that February morning light at this latitude produces. The Potomac was to the south and west, invisible from the mall, but present in the moisture quality of the February air. The formation running continuously. A planned capital, registered and filed. The institutional geography legible in the urban plan. The carrying structure moving through the plan's diagonal avenues at 0830 on a February morning, noting what was where and why. The third meeting with Catherine Walsh occurred in March of 1999. In a working group whose specific subject I will not disclose, but whose analytical requirements created a legitimate context for the intersection of her European security, architecture, expertise, and the cross-regional analytical responsibilities that my desk position carried. The meeting was 3 people: Walsh, myself, and a senior analyst whose institutional position required his presence and whose specific contribution to the meeting's analytical product was relevant and professionally accurate, and not the reason I am describing this meeting. The reason I am describing this meeting is that it produced a specific data point for the third file that the previous 2 in-person interactions had not produced. Walsh asked me a question. The question was analytically appropriate. It was within the scope of the meeting subject, and it reflected the specific gap between her European security architecture expertise and the cross-regional pattern assessment that my desk position was developing. The question was professionally correct. It was also in the specific register that 2 people who share a capacity for gap reading operate in an assessment probe. She was not asking me a question about the meeting's analytical subject. She was asking me a question that would reveal, in the answer, the specific quality of the analytical capacity of the person answering it. This is what Al-Rashid had done in the margin of the closing dinner in Amman in February of 1998. The recognition of a capacity in another person communicated through a specific kind of attention that the capacity recognition requires. Walsh's probe was more direct than Al-Rashid's. Al-Rashid had communicated the recognition without stating it. Walsh communicated the recognition through the specific form of the question, a question that was too precisely calibrated to the gap in my analytical product to be accidental, and that was calibrated with the specific precision of someone who was also reading the gap between stated positions and what the positions failed to capture. I answered the question. The answer was analytically appropriate and professionally accurate. It was also a response to the probe at the same level of precision that the probe had been delivered at confirming the recognition without stating the confirmation. The third file updated at 1,600 hours that afternoon. 141 words became 167. The update added the probe exchange as a data point, the first instance in the third file of 2 subjects whose pre-formal pattern recognition capacity was documented, registering each other's capacity directly rather than registering external environments. Al-Rashid had registered the observer. Walsh had registered the observer's analytical capacity. The file was now documenting a network rather than a collection of individual observations. 167 words. Still thin. But the shape had changed again from a collection of individual pre-formal pattern recognizers to a pattern of mutual recognition between people who shared the capacity. The significance of this change was not yet fully visible. The file was patient. The Potomac in the spring of 1999 was a different river from the Potomac in January. Not in its fundamental character, the 0.9 meters per second current, the wide gray-brown water. The specific quality of a river that moves through a low coastal plain without the alpine momentum that the Danube carried. But different in its surface quality, the way that any river is different in spring from winter, the light at a different angle, the air at a different temperature, the moisture quality of the mid-Atlantic spring, carrying the specific combination of the Chesapeake Bay's coastal moisture and the inland warming that produces the specific atmospheric condition of a Washington spring. I walked along the tidal basin at 0815 hours on a March morning. The cherry trees were not yet in bloom. The bloom was 2 weeks away, the specific timing that the National Park Service monitored and that produced the specific annual Washington event I had registered in briefing materials about the city before arriving, but had not yet experienced directly. The buds were present on the trees. The bloom was approaching. The specific patience of a bud that is complete but has not yet arrived. The third file was 167 words. The significance was still approaching. The file was the bud. The bloom was 2003-4 years away. I noted this parallel and did not entirely trust it. The formation is cautious about narrative, parallels the tendency to find meaning in coincidental structural similarities, is a specific category of assessment error that the formation teaches against. A bud is a bud. A file is a file. The similarity in their relationship to their eventual arrival does not tell you anything about the arrival or its timing or its nature. The parallel is aesthetically available. It is not analytically useful. Filed as noted, not trusted, registered as an aesthetically available parallel that the assessment methodology does not endorse. The cherry trees had not bloomed. The file had not arrived at its significance. The Potomac moved at 0.9 meters per second. The bank held. The D.C. posting lasted 22 months through the transition from 1999 to 2000. Through the specific institutional anxiety about the Y2K transition that the operational environment was processing, with the specific combination of institutional rigor and operational uncertainty that the formation had learned to calibrate in previous postings. The Y2K concern was legitimate, and the institutional response to it was correct, and the actual transition produced no operational disruption at the level the institutional concern had anticipated, which was itself a data point. The gap between the institutional assessment of the risk and the actual character of the risk, the probability assessment updated by the outcome, the calibration refined. The desk had produced its specific kind of visibility into the pattern of the career. The visibility had produced the recognition of the gap assessment as the permanent condition of the work rather than the specific requirement of each posting. The caring structure had registered this recognition and added it to the architecture not as a new weight, but as a new kind of clarity about the existing weight. The weight did not increase. The understanding of the weight changed. Catherine Walsh's third file contribution had changed the file's character from individual observations to a network pattern. The network was small 3 confirmed members, including Al-Rashid, Walsh, and the architect, with 2 additional names whose contributions to the file were less confirmed. 5 possible members of a pattern that the institutional vocabulary did not yet have a name for. The file was 167 words at the close of the D.C. posting. The pattern was legible enough to have a shape, but not yet legible enough to have an operational significance. 2001 was 1 year away. 2003 was 3 years away. The significance was approaching at the specific pace that significance approaches when it is genuine rather than anticipated, not with announcement, not with the dramatic acceleration of something arriving before its time, but with the specific steady approach of something that has been building since Bonn in 1988 and that has not been building faster or slower than the accumulation of the carrying structure has been building to receive it. The Potomac moved at 0.9 meters per second westward through the city. The desk work concluded. The field would resume in the next posting. The pattern that the desk had revealed would travel with the fieldwork into the next phase of the operational career. The bank holds, the water moves, the significance approaches. One more thing about Washington before the account moves into the next period. The planned city, l'Enfance 1791 geometry, the diagonal avenues, The institutional buildings placed where the plan said they should go produced a specific quality of operational clarity that the organic European capitals had not produced. In London or Vienna or Brussels, the institutional geography was layered onto an existing city in ways that required the operational assessment to read the institutional through the historical, to separate the contemporary function from the accumulated history of the physical space. The National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue was built in the 1930s. The Department of Justice was built in the 1934. The Treasury building dates from 1869. Each building carried its historical accretion into the present institutional function. In Washington's planned grid, the historical accretion and the institutional function were more nearly aligned. The buildings were built for the functions they served. The plan had anticipated the functions. The alignment produced a specific kind of legibility that the European cities did not produce in the same way. This is the quality of the desk work compared to the field work. The field work was organic, the operational assessment layered onto the complexity of a lived environment, reading the institutional through the historical, the operational function through the accumulated weight of all the environments the operational career had moved through. The desk work was planned, the institutional function more nearly aligned with the analytical task. The pattern assessment having access to a broader view that the field officer's local maximum resolution had not allowed. Both kinds of work were necessary. The field produced the data points at maximum resolution. The desk produced the pattern assessment that the maximum resolution data points could not produce alone. L'Enfance Plan and London's Organic Growth were both legitimate urban organizations. The Potomac and the Thames were both legitimate calibration references. The desk and the field were both legitimate locations for the formation's output to be applied. I registered this at 2,100 hours on the last evening of the DC posting, standing at the workspace window looking south toward the Potomac in the October darkness. The temperature was 12 degrees. The river was invisible in the darkness, but present in the direction I was looking, 0.9 meters per second, wide and slow, westward through the coastal plain. The 4,100 Kelvin fluorescent overhead. The gray-green institutional carpet. The third floor of the DIA headquarters building, 1.4 kilometers from the Capitol. Received, registered, filed. The DC posting complete. The next posting would return to the field. The field would carry the pattern visibility that the desk had produced the recognition of the gap assessment as the permanent condition of the work. The third file at 167 words and growing, the significance 3 years from its arrival. The formation would continue to run. The bank would continue to hold. The carrying structure would continue to carry what was placed on it. The gray operative, every week, without exception, start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. And if you have been here across 12 episodes from Pittsburgh in 1961 to Washington in 2000, then you understand that the account is not a sequence of postings. It is the construction of an architecture. Each episode adds to the architecture. The architecture holds what has been placed on it and waits for what is coming. 2001 is 1 year away. 2003 is 3 years away. The significance is approaching. The gray operative, every week, without exception. There is something about the specific texture of Washington institutional work that I have not yet described, and it belongs in this account because it belongs to the formation's continuous running, and because the carrying structure accumulates not just from the dramatic configurations, but from the sustained daily texture of the environment. The posting produces. The desk work produced a specific daily rhythm that the field postings had not produced. In the field, the operational day was organized around the specific requirements of the cover and the assessment work, the meetings, the functions, the professional adjacencies, the specific occasions that the operational logic created and that the formation had to fill with the correct quality of presence. The field day was responsive. The specific character of each day was determined by the specific operational configuration of that day. The desk day was structured, the same third-floor workspace, the same 4,100 Kelvin fluorescent overhead, the same gray-green institutional carpet, the same Potomac at 0.9 meters per second to the south, visible in daylight through the south-facing windows, and present as direction in the darkness of the early morning and late evening arrivals. The same coffee machine at 87 degrees until the grind adjustment and at 90 degrees thereafter. The same institutional rhythm of briefings and analytical products and working group meetings, and the sustained effort of assembling the pattern assessment that 18 years of field data points were contributing to. The structure was not unwelcome. The field had required the formation to be continuously responsive to what the environment produced. The desk allowed the formation to be continuously applied to what the formation had accumulated. The difference was the difference between building the structure and assessing what the structure had produced. Both required the full capacity of the formation. They required it differently. I walked to the Potomac Bank most mornings when the operational schedule allowed. The tidal basin was 1.8 kilometers from the DIA building, walkable, in the time between the morning briefing preparation and the first scheduled working group. On the mornings that allowed it, which were approximately 3 out of 5, I walked to the basin at 0715, registered the Potomac's specific morning quality, and filed it. The formation's requirement adapted to the specific geography, not the chain bridge at 0830 or the Grand Place at 1215, but the tidal basin at 0715, the river visible at the edge of the basin. The cherry tree buds or blossoms or summer leaves or autumn color depending on the season. The DC posting covered all 4 seasons. The cherry blossom bloom arrived in early April 1999, 2 weeks after the March morning when I had registered the buds as not yet arrived. The bloom lasted 10 days before the petals fell. I registered it on 4 mornings. The specific quality of the tidal basin, with the cherry trees in full bloom, the color, the light through the petals, the specific Washington spring atmosphere that the trees and the basin and the Capitol dome visible in the background produced together, filed. The formation running continuously, indifferent to whether the thing being registered is operationally significant or aesthetically present. The summer of 1999 brought the specific quality of a Washington summer, which is the specific quality of a city built in a tidal estuary whose geography the 18th century planners had not fully accounted for when they chose the site. The Chesapeake Bay moisture, the Potomac Basin humidity, the specific combination that produces Washington summers hot and wet in a way that is distinct from both the dry heat that Fort Huachuca had produced and the European summer heat that Vienna and Brussels had produced. The 4,100 Kelvin fluorescent overhead held the workspace at 21 degrees regardless of the season. Outside, the humidity registered in the breath vapor that did not disperse as quickly as the dry air had allowed in Amman. Catherine Walsh and I shared the same institutional environment across 22 months. The third file documented 8 analytical interactions across that period, 4 working group meetings, 3 shared analytical products, the 1 direct analytical probe exchange in March 1999. Each interaction added to the file's record of the network pattern, the mutual recognition documented with increasing precision as the interactions accumulated. The file grew from 104 words on the first day of the posting to 167 by the posting's close 63 words across 22 months. Slower growth than the first Amman meeting had produced in a single afternoon, but growth that changed the file's character more fundamentally than any equivalent volume of words had previously changed it. The network was the change. Individual observers documenting individual subjects had been what the file was for 3 years. The D.C. posting produced the first documentation of 2 subjects observing each other, the network's internal recognition visible in the file for the first time. The significance of this change was not immediately visible. The file was patient. The formation was patient. The bank held. The Millennium transition on the 1st of January 2000 occurred without operational disruption at the institutional level. The Y2K preparation had been thorough. The institutional response to the anticipated risk had been calibrated correctly to the risk's character as assessed, even if the character of the risk as it actually manifested was less severe than the worst-case assessment had modeled. The gap between the institutional assessment of the risk and the actual risk was a calibration data point. The calibration was updated, filed. I was in the DIA building at 2,345 hours on the 31st of December 1999, one of the operational staff maintaining continuity presence during the transition. The Potomac was to the south in the winter darkness, moving at 0.9 meters per second, indifferent to the specific anxiety that the institutional environment was processing. The 4,100 Kelvin overhead. The gray-green carpet, the transition from 1999 to 2000 registered as a calendar change and an operational continuity data point, and nothing more dramatic. The significance was 3 years away. I stood at the workspace window at 001, 5 hours on the 1st of January 2000, looking south toward the invisible Potomac. The temperature was 2 degrees Celsius. The breath vapor dispersed in approximately 1.3 seconds. The city outside was conducting its specific version of the transition fireworks over the mall, visible from the upper floors, audible through the building's windows, the specific sound and light of a planned capital, celebrating the turn of a millennium with the specific organized enthusiasm that planned capitals produce. I registered the fireworks, filed them. The formation indifferent to their significance in the cultural register, registering them as light and sound at a specific color temperature and sound pressure at a specific distance and atmospheric condition. The year changed. The posting continued. The carrying structure held. The file was patient. 3 years. The gray operative, every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. And if you have been listening since the beginning, since Pittsburgh in 1961, when the formation was being built without the formation's name, since West Point, when the name was given to the building, since the desert and Berlin and Vienna and Bonn and London and Budapest and Brussels and Amman and now the desk in Washington, then you understand that the account is not producing drama, it is producing weight. The weight of the accumulated gap assessments, the weight of the pattern that the desk revealed, the weight of a third file at 167 words that is documenting a network whose operational significance is 3 years from its arrival. The architecture holds, the water moves, and the significance is approaching. And the order is the architecture is the account. The carrying continues. The gray operative, every week, without exception.